But let's switch gears a little bit and let's bring on the man of many titles, columnist at Jackman Magazine, author of Logic for the Left. Give them an argument, Logic for the Left, host of the excellent podcast YouTube show, Give Them an Argument, and most importantly, comrade and friend, Ben Burgis. Man, thanks so much for joining us on your Left Reckoning debut.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, thrilled to have you joining us tonight, man. It should be a good one. So there's a couple things we wanted to get to. I know Matt has prepared some good sound for you. Do you want to do that first, or should we start with some of the censorship stuff?
Maybe let's dive right into the censorship stuff, and then we can wrap it up towards the end.
Yeah, let's have our dinner first, and then we can have our dessert. How about that? I mean, we've had versions of this conversations for a while now, Ben. Let me see if I have. Matt, do you have his article handy?
Yep.
Because this is something that I know that you experienced firsthand, but we have been dealing with for years and years and years, which is dealing with YouTube, and it's sometimes very, very seemingly random implementation of its community standards. On things that are very baffling. You experienced that firsthand and sort of were able to build out a larger argument as why the left should take, censorship by these tech companies much more seriously.
Yeah. So I've actually had a few run-ins with this lately. So one of them was actually, if you just scroll very slightly down there, you can see, there we go. Right. So I interviewed this woman, Natalie Wynn, on the show. And the thumbnail for the episode was removed by YouTube. And they said in the email that it violated their sex and nudity policy. So, check it out. Like if people are listening to this later in the podcast version.
Is it like the Saudis write this sex and nudity policy?
Yeah. I don't know. And then more recently on January 6th, we did a live stream that had, several people who, Forrest Miller, C. Derek Varn from Zero Books, Gene Bajalan, none of whom, needless to say, are Trumpists, to put it mildly. And that one was removed, and like the thumbnail that we just showed you, that was eventually restored, but this live stream still hasn't been restored by YouTube. We appealed this right away.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the one that we did on the 6th, but it was randomly taken down like 4 or 5 days later. And they said that in the email that it was because of their policy against spreading disinformation, that there was significant fraud that changed the outcome of the election. Mm-hmm. Which actually there were even people who got mad at me on Twitter because I pointed this out, and I was like, guys, I mean, this is obviously, everybody here is very anti-Trump. Nobody was saying that.
Yeah. And
people were interpreting that as like, oh, so you're saying it would have been okay if you had this? Like, no, we're saying the rationale makes no sense. It's bizarre on its own terms. And I guess I should also add that even before this, I remember when I was just doing videos for Zero Books, promote my first book, there was something like this that happened, that there was a Ben Shapiro video where he's talking about, like, he's basically answering the question why, since according to him, Democrats are all horribly anti-Israel and this and that, why is it the most Jews vote for Democrats? And he laid out his thoughts about that. Mm-hmm. And I did what really like a pretty anodyne, like a pretty nerdy and pedantic video being like, well, these reasons don't make sense. What about this? What about that? And that was flagged by YouTube as hate speech. And in that case, like, I mean, there's a whole range here in these incidents that kind of gives you the buffet of how YouTube censorship works. Because like in the Ben Shapiro one, because the name of the video was Ben Shapiro's wrong about Israel and American Jews. And so I'm sure that the reason why they kept it flagged after the appeal was that whatever YouTube employee had to look at 300 of these videos that morning,
Yeah.
probably for like sub minimum wage in a country in the global South, probably like saw the word Jews. It's like, oh, okay, probably is hate speech, and upheld it. The sex and nudity one, no clue. I have no idea what was going on there. And then like the one about the January 6th riot, yeah, it's somewhere in between. We probably used some keywords that the algorithm picked up on. I don't really know. But the bigger question is, imagine how outrageous it would be if there was some government censorship office that was acting this capriciously. And it was this hard to figure out even why they made the decisions they made, much less, what the rationale was or anything like that. And what bothers me is that some people who normally have, left-wing or at least very progressive views, when they start talking about stuff like this, they suddenly become libertarians that, it's a problem for freedom if the government does it, but, not if it's a private corporation, they can do what they want.
Yeah, forgetting any sense of like commons, for instance. I want to also bring up the Zero Books had a recent spout with this over Great Replacement sort of not adjacent. I don't want to say that. You have to be super careful around this COVID stuff because that is one of their third rails. But basically saying like this is how the powerful in society are going to take advantage of this in the sort of shock doctrine sense. And actually, now that I'm talking about it, I think it was resolved. But was that adequately resolved for Zero Books, or are they still awaiting?
The last I heard, it was at a weird in between point. So apparently, they'd done the video, like the video had been taken down, and like they put up some sort of like whatever you call that, like clone of it, and YouTube admitted that the original video was fine and lifted the restriction, but then they gave them a strike again for the same reason for the second video, which gives you a sense again of how arbitrary and absurd this is. The way that the enforcement works for it, and because like I think literally, I believe they're like one strike away from having like much more serious consequences. So, and this is because of a repeat of something that YouTube itself has admitted was fine.
Right.
And it's like, I mean, I just want to say, because I know some people might be interested in this, like YouTube is very funny to work with. And, Matt and I have been doing this for a long time. We've learned some things and it's constantly changing. Like, it's hard when something is like breaking news. Especially an international event is breaking news. Like if you do anything that's like too on the nose, especially anything like Israel Palestine, right? Like you are just going to get cut out. So you learn how to do a lot of like euphemisms for everything.
Yeah, right. So when that Ben Shapiro video was taken down, I remember, I texted our late friend Michael about it, and he told me, oh yeah, like you got to be real careful. Like when I did a video that was about something related, it was about like a one state solution, Israel Palestine. I just we just called the video "Democracy in the Middle East," and
I remember that conversation actually, which is so funny actually. Because it's just like it's an empty title, right? It's like "Democracy in the Middle East." Who knows what this is going to be about, right?
And the conversation sounds like a conversation you'd have if you were in like a dictatorship and you were talking about how some like movie script could make it past the state censorship office. And it's like, okay, well, we can't directly criticize the great leader, but if we do this, then people will understand that we're criticizing him, and they'll allow that. And it's insane that we have to use this to get past the censorship protocols at YouTube, because I mean, for one thing, actually, like there's been lots of in mainstream politics, there's been lots of discussion about whether, YouTube and some of these other tech companies are technically monopolies. That's not a fringe thing at all. But even if you think, no, they're not, according to Hoyle, monopolies, they certainly control a massive portion of the flow of information in our society. And so to the extent that our concern about speech and censorship isn't isn't just purely about, what the government can do and what the government can't do, but it's about a broader set of concerns about the free flow of ideas and information, which I would argue it always has been, right? I mean, even like as venerable liberal institution as like banned books week, like that does concern decisions, or requests made to books and library, bookstores and libraries that are under no legal obligation to carry any particular book. But, we still see that as a concern, about speech. And I think that there's something especially disturbing about this when people on the left, don't always seem to be tracking this distinction, because this is like this idea that freedom, as long as there's some private entity that's not technically forcing you to do something, and you're just voluntary contracting, that left reckoning could leave YouTube, and it could just be on I don't know, like
Vimeo.
like some Vimeo or whatever, like this. Once you kind of follow that breadcrumb of thought, like that's libertarianism. The whole point of being a socialist is that you think that you can have arrangements that are technically, legally free contracts that are still incredibly oppressive.
Yeah, and I just I'd like to sort of broaden it out a little bit, because like the YouTube stuff is definitely interesting, but I also think it's particularly interesting to us.
Sure, because we're all we're all tenant farmers under YouTube.
But like one of the larger aspects of this, and what I really like about your piece, and just in general your arguments on this, is trying to make people understand that so YouTube has this massive power. This has been a problem with YouTube for a very long time, right? And it's a problem with a lot of these other platforms, is that they basically are able to write their own rules, and they're not really accountable to even their users, right? And that's a problem. But I think you could say that yes, it's a problem of censorship, but it's also a platform problem, right?
Yeah.
But I think what's really important for us to sort of zoom it out is to understand that these kind of stories would probably get a lot more play with people if there really hadn't been this growing acceptance from a lot of people across the country, and also in large portions of the left, to accept like political censorship from tech companies as a good thing, actually, not just as something that occurs, but as something that's positive, like the kind of celebration when you see people's accounts getting deactivated by like Twitter and Facebook. And how would you sort of frame that position or argument about why that might not be a particularly good thing to celebrate, to have YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter being able to decide good speech versus bad speech?
And let me just throw on the table, to kind of implicate myself here. I think I sent off a tweet that you could argue was celebrating Project Veritas getting booted off Twitter tonight. Now, Ben, let me know how you would approach that.
So look, I mean, I think there's celebrated like you take some some Schadenfreude in it, and there's celebrating.
It's funny.
Let me just say, my position is always, I never want to make any of this stuff a priority for the left. It's more if it happens, it happens. So I just want to
look, I mean, I think lots of things are funny that I don't actually support. If we're gonna have a discussion about what I think the rules should be, I would definitely make a distinction there, right? Between just sort of being amused that something's happening, or taking some sort of satisfaction in something happening, and thinking, oh yeah, this is good. This is on reflection what should happen. And I think that actually gets back to what David is asking, because I think that is, I think failure to track that distinction is actually the source of a lot of the problem here. That very often, I think people end up, when they're talking about, this YouTube or Twitter deplatforming or doxing, like people, people being fired, because of what they've tweeted. I think very often people, especially, including, not especially, but including people on our side, react to that primarily through this prism of, are the people that we hate going to get punished?
Mm.
And that's what we're really focused on. Are we going to punish the bad people? And I guess I would just go back to something that Adolf Reed, I remember, saying in one of his TMBS interviews, which is that this is just too Protestant a way of looking at politics. It's like all about who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. And we should have other priorities, it shouldn't be about that.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was also going to say, like the YouTube platforms we've been talking about, or like, you guys might have touched on this earlier in the episode, but I don't know. But, but when you see, it's like, oh, this person got fired for their tweets, great, right? That's they're being punished. They're bad people. They're being punished. It's worth thinking about things like just today or yesterday, it came out that that Nathan Robinson, was fired from his job as a Guardian columnist for tweeting a very mild joke about U.S. military support for the state of Israel. And I think that so one thing is just like, okay, let's think hard about the rules and who's enforcing them, because these people aren't our friends. They're not, like none of the people making decisions at YouTube or Twitter or any major institution have the left's best interests at heart. But then the other thing is just going back to the Adolf Reed point, should this be what we're really focused on? The bad people being fired? Because this kind of seems to me like this is the difference between leftism and conservatism, really, right? Like do you think about politics primarily through the prism of thinking about like individual moral character? This person is bad, and so like that's what we should focus on. Or do you think of politics primarily in terms of institutions and what the arrangements of power should be? And it seems to me that if you're thinking of it in the second way, then you should be very eager to disempower corporate censors, to make it hard to fire people, to make it hard to deplatform people, both because that's just the kind of society that we'll want to create, and that's and because it's also what's in our interests, right now, to like just pragmatically, in the near future. And the last little thing I'd say to put a bow on this is, I know that some people, when they watch things like this, they listen to things like this, they're always kind of prepared with the examples. Like, okay, but what about this thing? Are you saying that this shouldn't have happened? That, that this person shouldn't have been kicked off for this thing, or they shouldn't have, been demonetized. They shouldn't have been fired for that thing, because I think they should. It's like, no, you don't have to be an absolutist about this, right? You don't think, like you don't have to think that the ideal like terms of service for YouTube or Twitter should be, you can literally say anything at any time.
That's one thing. Like, we talked with Edward Angueso last week about Section 230 and there's big structural changes we can do, and I think we all are in agreement that antitrust and those sorts of standards are what's needed here. But one thing that always seems to me like a common sense thing you could force on these companies is to be transparent about these judgments they're making. Right? Like this vague gesturing towards terms of service that everyone can see is just bullshit, and then them covering their ass, as opposed to say, and obviously they don't do this because this would require like hiring people like a team of ombuds persons to adjudicate these things. But I have heard Facebook has been talking about doing like an in-house private version of that. And ultimately like that needs to be forced and under like statutory public control. But like those things, like, I mean, I think of all sorts of right wingers who I think occasionally have strong arguments that they didn't break the terms of service, at least in the sense that other people are.
Yeah, right.
Right. But I want to hear like, if it is because, this person just has a history documented, like James O'Keefe, right? He's literally like paid money because he's a fraudster. Like he paid money to Acorn, right? Like then put that in writing, because I want to see you have to put that in writing for the leftists too, because I mean, look, maybe this is naive of me, but like, go on, David.
Oh no, I mean, if you were going somewhere, I was
I
just
mean, I
going
just
to,
want to see I just want to see those things spelled out, because I think when you allow it to go in the dark, it allows people to fester on it, and I think it's easier to all of a sudden snap up all these left wing ones without having to like put anything down in writing that
No,
would
no,
maybe upset your
exactly.
workforce.
so
I think that's just short and sweet. I mean, like if because if it's unclear at this point, it's like what we're advocating. It's
mhm.
just that there be like it's not that there's no terms of service. It's not that you can't get kicked off if you threaten somebody or you like scream racist insults at them or whatever. It's that we want there to be really specific, really explicit guidelines, and that I think that those guidelines should generally, given gray areas, err on the side of allowing more free speech than not. That's it.
And what I was going to say is like, look, there are people who spend a lot more time thinking about like the particularities of this than I do. But what my general feeling on this is rather than coming up with, here are the different circumstances and here's like the good way to, come down on a user and here's the bad way to come down on the user, is to understand what kind of developments are happening with how unilaterally these companies feel that they can act, right? And that is like a kind of more of a power analysis, right? Because like if you do see like an extremely active role for these companies like coming after, I mean, sorry, like the president, right? Like that is an extremely active role from these kind of companies. And to ask yourself, what are the dynamics at play behind this? Because what the stuff with Trump and Twitter is 100% new administration and a flip in the power dynamic and the power analysis from the Twitter corporation, right? Which means that these corporations, just as they did with Trump when he was lying about the coronavirus and all these other things, are going to cozy themselves up or act in the way that protects them and their interests in the best way, right? So it's like, I think at a certain point, like if we spend too much time, like even, going into the philosophical question of like free speech absolutism or anything like that, we actually distract ourselves from what the actual play is. Because these actors, like the corporations themselves, aren't sitting there, with their group of philosophers and saying like, what's the way to like, have a vibrant version of free speech in our
Wait, no,
society?
sorry, David. I saw a thread from Jack Dorsey, and he basically said it's
I'm
Bitcoin.
sure.
So, um,
they're trying to figure out how they can protect the future of their company.
Yeah,
and,
no,
and
right.
profit line, right?
And it is really like, look, I mean, even if you think for the sake of argument that that's justified in that case, like there's still something really disturbing about the way that people trivialize it. It's like, oh, whatever. He's still got plenty of other platforms. Not a big deal. It's like, look, imagine that, we're in, I don't know, 2040, whatever. And, President, just make her Rashida Tlaib. That's my favorite. Is like there's a general strike going on, and President Tlaib, was accused of incitement for giving like a really rabble rousing speech, to the strikers. And so there's this long list of social media platforms that have cut her off.
Mm-hmm.
Would we think that was a big deal? I think we would think it was a big deal, because you're talking about the president of the United States losing a bunch of channels of communication to the general public. And I think that is a significant, speech issue. It's certainly a crazy power play by those companies. And I think whatever you think about the outcome in any given case, whether you think it's the right decision or not, I think what we should be disturbed by, the point that we should be making is, one, as socialists, I think we should be saying, look, this is not a way, having a few tech CEOs be empowered to make these decisions is not a way for a reasonable society to run its digital commons. We should bring them under some form of public ownership, and then have really explicit, specific, narrow guidelines that are available for everybody to look at, that tell you this is exactly what'll get you kicked off, this won't, and because that's how, do we want to live in a society where it's this easy for Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg to silence people? I certainly don't.
yeah.
I think
I mean, so one kind of wrinkle to that I like monitored a little bit is the Zuckerberg talking to his employees who wanted to do more, that their platform was a giant right-wing propaganda or like operation basically. And basically Zuckerberg and I forget the guy's name, the guy who was with Kavanaugh, but basically overruled the workers, right? But in a way that I think kept more, I guess, openness for particularly the political right, at least, on the platform. How do we? Because I mean, there was also the Google union thing, and like I think certain people scoff at that. With I mean, some degree you can see why. Like tech workers aren't exactly like what you think stereotypically. At the same time, worker control over these platforms is better than executive control, right? So what do we think about that? Because I think like. I definitely don't want to trust that. And I definitely like, even if Facebook all of a sudden was a worker controlled co-op, we'd still want to disassemble
to be able to unilaterally control these things.
Exactly. Right. I just wanted, what do you think about that? Cause I think of like, if these were, I don't know, it's hard for me like to formulate this, but I feel like I trust Facebook's employees more than I trust Facebook's executives.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I trust Facebook's employees more than I trust Facebook's executives, but I do. But I mean, I also think that, taking these, there's a kind of dynamic that's played out in a bunch of these places where if like, workers or some group of workers, at one of these tech companies, maybe wants to censor someone, then and then the company does it. Say, oh, well, see, it was the workers want to do it. It's like, yeah, but they weren't the ones decided to do this. Why is this the one time
they're going
to listen to the workers? They're not going to listen to them about like pay or, discipline or any of these things. It's just this, it's like, well, no, it's because it's kind of what you wanted to do anyway. I mean, I guess on the broader question, I just say that, I mean, there's no guarantee, we don't want it's not like the reason we want economic democracy is that we think that workers or communities are always going to make the right choices. They're not, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that the same way that it could be true that sometimes in places you could have hereditary monarchs who make more tolerant decisions, than parliaments, but that doesn't mean that we like monarchy. It could be that, yeah, sure, maybe sometimes the CEO, makes a more benevolent or tolerant decision, but we want to step back and say, okay, so in this case it worked out, but do we generally want a few CEOs making these decisions? Mm-hmm. And I still think no. And I still think, and I also agree with Matt's last point that there are lots of things that we don't want it to be in the hands of private corporations, even if they were like, obviously it would be amazing if YouTube or Facebook or any of these places, we became, worker cooperatives. Mm-hmm. But there are things that we don't want in the control of even worker cooperative private corporations, the same way we wouldn't want like worker cooperative private health insurance.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. And I think that's a conversation we can have later, but like a good example of that would be is if you have a worker cooperative, factory, whatever it produces, it might be in their interest to dump the sludge or whatever the byproduct is, down the river. And that might not be in the interest of the community down the street, right? That's why, we can't just divide everything up into smaller bits and hope for better solutions. But before,
no, totally.
I want to. Yeah. You have one final. I just want to take on real quick, like, oh crap, damn! I just thought you say what you're going to say, David. I'll remember what I was just going to.
Oh, I was just going to move on to the other. Clips,
yeah, well, no, but I mean, I think that's right. I mean, there are conflicted interests. You don't have like, I mean, you would still. I mean, if we had a economy with a where like the entire private sector of the economy, was worker co-ops. I mean, that would be like unimaginably amazing, as far as like the achievement of our political goals.
Yeah, of course.
But even in that economy, I would still want like aggressive environmental regulation. I would still want like things that were really important public goods to be directly provisioned, by the state. So we took them out of the markets because even worker controlled firms do still respond to a lot of the bad incentives that regular capitalist companies do.
Yeah, and even imagining a worker co-op YouTube or Facebook trying to get off the ground, it would be and having a worker co-op background instead of like a Silicon Valley background, it would have been strangled in its crib for like copyright immediately, right? All these platforms, including YouTube, has massively profited, and I know this because I used to play copyright music on Majority Report all the time for like years before they started cracking down on it, right? Like these companies were
It's the golden
printing
age.
money. Yeah.
I know. I just had a real pang of jealousy, because David does this weekly segment on my show where we talk about country music, and it would be amazing if we could
just
play
listen to
copyrighted
it.
music on there.
Literally, I used to. It was one of the best parts of working at Majority Report is I got to play like a song every day that could be thematically linked. Like if Panama Papers came out, I played Panama by Van Halen. And that was
so
allowed,
awesome.
and that was money in YouTube's pocket every time. Like that was value add for YouTube. So like, yeah, none of these platforms would have been allowed to get as big as they were if they were actually had a radical like ownership model. It's only because they were making money for Silicon Valley that they were allowed to become these giant propaganda monstrosities that they are.
No. Well, yeah, exactly. I know. I think that's such a good point, and it's such a throwback to the golden age.
We used to play like on TMBS I'm blanking on that Harlem rap. Neither of you guys tell me on that. Oh man, somebody in the chat will let us.
Oh, I'm sorry, man.